Hello dear friends. Tonight we will continue our journey exploring the winter stories of the medieval world. In the previous episode we followed the knights and lived through the freezing nights inside those harsh stone castles. But that was only one small fragment of the winter picture of the past. So what about ordinary people? Those who had no sturdy castle walls to shield them, no luxurious furs to cover their beds, no guards taking shifts to ensure their safety. During the harsh era of the Little Ice Age, they had to find their own ways to stay warm, to survive, to protect their families through each long night. So, what exactly did they do to withstand that relentless cold? And how did those simple, humble houses manage to become a warm refuge in the cruelest winters of Europe? Tonight, we are going to find out together. So, before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so I know I always have you by my side. And if you're watching this video from some small corner of the world, please leave your location and local time down below. Now turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let us step gently into tonight's journey together. Imagine a winter so cold that the moment you step outside, your nostrils nearly freeze shut, and if you forget your cloak, there's a good chance you'll turn into a statue within a few hours. That was Europe during the medieval Little Ice Age. For you, a modern winter might mean a mug of hot cocoa, a favourite film and a two-way air conditioner. But for people in the Middle Ages, no cocoa, no heating systems, and sometimes not even proper windows. There was only wind, snow, and one very real fear. Will I live to see spring? The Little Ice Age, a name that sounds harmless, almost like a children's song, was in reality a series of decades and centuries defined by severe cold, failed harvests, mass livestock deaths, and people who had to constantly wrestle with a single question: how do I avoid freezing to death at night? It wasn't a philosophical question. It was one every person had to answer in order to survive winter. In that age, winter did not know mercy. It didn't care whether you were rich or poor, strong or weak, newly married or arguing with your neighbours. One night of sub-zero temperatures could ensure your entire household never woke up again. A single draught slipping through the wall, a hole in the roof, or a night when the fire in the hearth went out, and the thin line between life and death was instantly broken. The sad truth is that many medieval families didn't survive winter simply because their houses weren't warm enough. They didn't build houses to look beautiful. They didn't build them to look impressive. They didn't build them to make their neighbours jealous. No, they built them to survive. Nothing more. And frankly, many of those houses look like crooked wooden huts that a strong gust of wind could rip apart. But don't laugh too soon, because despite looking flimsy, those homes were brilliant examples of how people could engineer entire survival systems using nothing more than straw, mud, wood, stone, and a tremendous amount of desperation. When winter arrived, you would see each tiny village shrink into itself. People hurried to pile extra straw onto roofs, seal every crack in the walls with clay and sheep's wool, and gather livestock into barns so that they could use their body heat. Yes, you heard correctly. When life gets cold enough, humans and cows become teammates on the same battlefield. But let's return to the bigger picture. Temperatures back then, especially from the 14th to 17th centuries, could drop to levels that today only the Arctic would recognise. The River Thames froze solid. People held festivals on its icy surface as if it were a giant natural skating rink. That may sound festive, but it was only the surface of the iceberg, literally. Beneath that spectacle was the reality of ordinary people battling the cold in every breath. Many poor families, unable to afford firewood, collected dried animal dung to burn, something no one would want to smell in summer but a lifesaver in winter. In that world, building a house wasn't an artistic project. It was a survival equation. A sealed house, plus thick walls, plus a warm roof, plus a fire, surviving one more season. Every home was a fortress against the most silent and fearsome enemy of that era, the cold. And even when you did everything right, the danger remained. A sudden shift of wind, an unexpected storm, or a heavy mass of snow collapsing the roof could undo all your efforts. Yet what's admirable, and in a darkly humorous way, almost endearing, is that people kept adapting. The harsher the winter, the more ingenious they became. Everyone became an accidental thermal engineer, choosing house sites with the best sunlight, sealing walls with anything that stopped the wind, building roofs as thick as 4 hand spans, because if not, well, good luck next winter. Looking back, you'll see that life then, though brutal, somehow made people more connected to each other, to the land, and to the roofs over their heads. Every house carried a story of effort, survival, and sometimes bleak humour born from desperation. If the wind changes direction tonight, we'll probably have a few new human ice statues by morning. But it is precisely these hardships that highlight the resilience of medieval people. They had very little. No modern comforts, no technology, no heating systems. And yet they still managed to build shelters warm enough to keep their families alive through the harshest winters Europe had ever known. And that is where we begin to understand. Medieval people did not build houses so they could live comfortably. They built them so they wouldn't die. They built as if every stone were a promise, every bundle of straw a hope, every roof a simple wish. Just let us survive tonight. When you think about building a house in the Middle Ages, people didn't begin by choosing timber or calculating how thick the wall should be. The very first thing they thought about was where to place the house. Because in a world where winter could erase an entire family's future in just a single season, location wasn't simply a priority. It was the first layer of insulation, and sometimes the most important one. You'll see this very clearly if you imagine yourself standing in the medieval European landscape. Bitter northern winds cutting across empty fields, fog clinging to damp valleys, and the great rivers exhaling cold like the breath of winter itself. In such a setting, if you placed your house in the wrong spot, everything else about the building became almost meaningless. That is why medieval people, though they lacked modern scientific knowledge, were extremely strategic when choosing where to settle. They observed nature not to contemplate it, but to survive it. South-facing slopes were always the best choice. The south receives more sunlight throughout winter, and sunlight back then wasn't just a pleasant luxury. It was life itself. A house placed on a south-facing slope absorbed several extra hours of warmth each day, and in an age of relentless cold, those few hours could change a family's fate. More sunlight meant warmer walls, less ice, and livestock that were not as drained by the long months of gloom. Valleys, what we now see as beautiful and poetic, were in medieval times almost a trap. Cold air sinks, moisture lingers, fog settles. A house built in a valley was almost always cold, damp, and never quite dry. For medieval people that meant sickness, rot, and long nights where even fire struggled to keep its warmth. They avoided valleys not because of any advanced scientific discovery, but because generations of experience proved that living there was making life unnecessarily hard, or, worse, dangerously short. Stories passed down in villages often mentioned houses in lowlands where the elderly and the young were always the first victims of winter. Living near forest was a clear advantage, not only because of easy access to firewood, but because trees created a natural windbreak. Northern winds during the Little Ice Age were brutal and wet, slicing through open settlements like sharpened knives. A house near a woodland was partially shielded, and even a few degrees difference could mean sleeping more safely during a night of howling wind. Over time, people realized the forest didn't only give them wood, it gave them a buffer against the sky. And this is also why living near a river, something that seems convenient to us today, was approached with immense caution in medieval times. River air in winter is relentlessly cold. The air is damper, heavier, and chills a person to the bone. Riverside winds slip straight into houses. Families understood this so well that many villages settled far from the water, choosing instead to dig wells or walk long distances for household water. The inconvenience was worth far more than waking up each night in a freezing icebox. All these choices reveal that medieval people truly read the language of nature. They had no maps, no meteorological stations, no instruments to measure wind direction or temperature. But they observed every season, every gust of wind, every day of sunshine, every foggy dawn. Through this quiet accumulation of knowledge, they chose their homes not by whim, but by inherited wisdom. A properly placed house could reduce a third of winter's severity, not through magic, but through simple survival intelligence, catching sunlight, avoiding lowlands, leaning into the forest, keeping distance from rivers. These silent choices allowed countless families to make it through a second winter, a third, a 10th. That is why, in hindsight, you'll realize that medieval settlement location was a mental chess match with life and death. It wasn't an aesthetic decision, nor was it luck. It was the product of long observation and deep fear of winters that always seemed colder, longer, harsher than expected. More importantly, medieval people understood that walls and roofs only worked if placed in the right place. A house in a damp valley remained useless no matter how thick the walls were. A warm thatched roof meant nothing if the house sat beside a river that blasted cold air all day long. On the other hand, a simple, even humble home placed wisely could become the warmest refuge of all. So before building walls or roofs, the first thing any medieval family did was find a location where one could survive. Not the prettiest place, but the warmest, the gentlest, the least windy, the sunniest. A place where winter, no matter how cruel, would take longer to defeat them. That was the first and the most essential survival skill of medieval winter life, choosing the right place to live, and in doing so they gave winter fewer chances to win. When you finally choose a warm enough location to build your house, you still cannot breathe a sigh of relief, because even if the house faces the sun, avoids river winds and escapes damp valleys, there remains one silent enemy right beneath your feet: the winter ground. And if the cold in the air makes you shiver, then the cold rising from the earth is what truly has the power to steal the warmth from an entire family. Winter soil is not merely cold, it freezes. It traps water inside its tiny channels, allowing moisture to rise continuously, seeping into every floorboard and every material that touches it. Building a house directly on top of such ground was no different from accepting that the cold would infiltrate every stone, every plank of wood, every corner of the structure. For that reason, medieval people understood very early on, to survive the winter, you must lift your home away from the ground. And so the technique of building the foundation, seemingly simple, became one of the most crucial elements of survival architecture at the time. People began by raising the house floor instead of letting it sit directly on the earth. Depending on the region, they used wood or stone to create this elevated system. In areas with abundant timber, large planks were laid atop sturdy wooden posts, creating an open space below. In places richer in stone, large rocks were stacked to form foundational supports, and wooden flooring was then laid across them like a platform, separated entirely from the frozen soil. Even to the naked eye, you can see that elevating the floor keeps the house drier and creates a natural air cushion. Air circulating beneath prevents moisture from building up, slows the rotting of wooden boards, and most importantly, stops the cold from the earth from travelling directly into human bodies. This wasn't just an innovation. It became practically a requirement for any house that needed to survive multiple winters. Using large stones as a foundation was also a clever strategy. Without concrete or steel, carefully selected stones arranged in sturdy rows not only provided structural support but also created much-needed separation between damp ground and the living space above. Stone does not absorb water the way wood does. It does not rot. And most importantly, when arranged properly, it acts as a natural barrier against moisture. Medieval people discovered this very early, likely through simple observation. Anything that touched the soil stayed damp and cold for far longer. From this collective experience, they developed a stone foundation system that was not technically complex but remarkably effective. It was the wisdom of an era without architectural blueprints, yet possessing an instinctive sensitivity to nature's laws. And even more ingenious was their deliberate creation of ventilation gaps beneath the floor, something modern observers sometimes misunderstand as a source of cold, when in fact it was the key to the house's durability. Without airflow, moisture would accumulate, wood would rot quickly, insects would flourish, and after only a few winters the house would shelter mold more than humans. The slits were not meant to make the house colder, but drier, and a dry house is always warmer than a damp one, no matter how simple the materials. For that reason, creating an air gap beneath the floor became one of the most effective anti-moisture techniques developed in medieval Europe, one still found in many traditional houses today. Viewed as a whole, the medieval foundation was like the hidden garment of the home, a layer unseen but decisive. If the foundation was raised, dry and separated from the ground's cold grip, then everything above, walls, roof, hearth, worked better. But if the foundation was wrong, every other attempt to keep warm lost almost half its effectiveness. This made foundation building the most important step, sometimes even more important than choosing materials for the walls. Medieval families understood this well. When preparing to build a house, they spent days finding and placing foundation stones. They observed airflow, calculated the ideal gap between floor and soil, and even checked how strongly the ground absorbed moisture. Though not technically advanced, these decisions carried a subtle precision refined through generations. Imagine medieval people living in low-raised floor houses, not towering structures like tropical stilt homes, but still safely lifted above the earth. And you see how they used every small detail to battle winter. They couldn't make winter less cold, but they could make their homes less cold, and that tiny difference saved countless lives. Over time, raised floors became a familiar feature of rural European architecture. It's a detail modern viewers often overlook in historical reconstructions, yet it was a core element of survival. Standing inside a medieval house, you would feel the difference instantly. Breathable wooden floors, no icy breath rising from the soil, and though the house was humble, the warmth created by its structure felt unmistakably real, All of this shows that medieval people did not face winter only with clothing or fireplaces. They fought the cold from its source, the earth. They understood that to keep warmth in, they first had to stop the cold from coming in. And the first step was to lift themselves away from the frozen ground. In the grand narrative of how people survived winters during the Little Ice Age, the foundation of a house might not seem glamorous, but it was a quiet determinant of life or death. A dry foundation was the proof that they understood their true enemy. And from that very foundation, they built their lives, adrift in the cold, but never defeated. When the house's floor had been raised and separated from the freezing ground, you would realize that the battle against the medieval winter was still far from over. If the cold rising from the earth was an enemy you could see, then the cold from the air was a far more patient adversary. It hid within every current of wind, slipped through every gap, and waited for a single mistake to creep inside the home. For that reason, medieval people had to create a thermal armour surrounding their dwelling, and that armour was the wall. From a distance, the walls of a medieval house might look simple, even so rustic that you would not think they held any special value. But as you approached, you would notice that each type of wall was the result of generations of observation, trial, and hard lessons learned from unforgiving winters. Medieval people did not build walls to be beautiful. They built them to block wind, retain heat, and protect the fragile warmth inside. The most common type of wall was timber, the timber frame. Wood was not just the most accessible material of the age, it was the warmest natural armour the forest could offer. When you touched timber in winter, it was cold, yes, but not with the stark, bone-deep chill of stone. Wood retained heat well, did not conduct cold too quickly, and most importantly, its thickness helped block drafts. Large beams were erected into frames, joined together with wooden pegs instead of metal nails. Standing inside such a wooden house, you would feel noticeably warmer, not because the timber generated heat, but because it did not steal your warmth the way stone did. But not everyone had enough good wood to build, so most ordinary Europeans used a more economical and clever technique: wattle and daub. Flexible woven branches forming a lattice, then coated with a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung and sand. It sounded crude, even instinctive, but once dried, the mixture became solid, thick, and exceptionally good at insulation. Standing next to a wattle and daub wall in winter, you would feel the indoor air far more stable. It was not as cold as stone, did not shrink like wood, and above all could breathe naturally, preventing moisture from becoming trapped. In many cases, this was the warmest type of wall ordinary people could build. Cheap, durable, easy to repair, and highly effective against cold. Wealthier families, or those living in regions abundant in stone, chose stone walls. Entering a medieval stone house, you would immediately feel its solidity. Thick, heavy, steadfast, as though no wind could ever break through. Stone walls could last hundreds of years, but that was also the problem. Stone was hardy, yet it was also cold. It absorbed the winter's chill and held onto it for a very long time, making life inside such a house in January feel like living in a miniature ice cavern. So what did medieval people do to counter this flaw? They lined the interior with wooden planks, turning the outer stone into a hard shield while the inside became warmer thanks to timber. The gap between the two layers was often filled with dry straw, animal hair, or old fibre scraps to increase insulation. This was an ancient version of the insulated wall we modern people now use. If you placed one hand on the stone wall and then on the wooden lining, you would feel the difference immediately. The stone was so cold it numbed your fingers, while the wood felt much gentler, a warm boundary to keep you from facing the harsh outside cold directly. The most impressive thing about medieval wall building was its adaptability. They did not commit to one single method. They combined layers depending on location, weather, and the family's resources. A house might have a timber frame, mud plaster, and a low stone exterior to block wind. Or the opposite, stone foundations with wattle and daub above to reduce coldness. The brilliance lay in their understanding of materials, which ones drew in cold, which ones held warmth, and which ones had to be combined to defeat winter. Entering a medieval home, you might not immediately see the labour behind those walls, but if you observed closely, each layer would tell you a story. Thick timber to stop the wind, clay layers to retain warmth, straw and animal hair hidden inside to block the cold, stone on the outside to endure storms and snow. All these combined into a thermal armour surrounding the home, much like the many layers of clothing medieval people had to wear throughout winter. What made these walls remarkable was not artistic finesse, but human perseverance. Without modern technology, without thermometers or insulation diagrams, they still understood precisely how heat behaved. They did not need charts to know stone was cold, clay was warm, or straw reduced drafts. Everything came from experience, from winters long enough to teach them the hard way. And so, medieval walls became something that did not only block wind, but also held back the despair of cold. They protected the breath of the family inside, kept warmth lingering longer, and eased the fear that came whenever night fell. If the raised foundation was the first step in separating humans from the freezing ground, then the walls were the second embrace, a quiet, steadfast one, supporting life during the harshest months of the European winter. When the walls have been raised firmly, separating you from the cold drifting through every current of winter wind, there is still one final element needed for a medieval house to truly become a refuge: the roof. If the walls are armour, then the roof is the great blanket laid over everything, deciding whether the house can retain its precious warmth or lose it hopelessly to the winter sky. In an age without heating systems, without glass windows, without synthetic insulating materials, medieval people had to rely on nature in ways that were crude, yet strangely effective. And among these, the thatched roof was one of the simplest and most ingenious inventions. If you walk up to a thatched roof of that era, the first thing you notice is this: it is thick, in some places up to 60 centimetres. That's nearly the length of an entire forearm. Bundles of straw were tightly bound and layered row upon row, each one overlapping the one beneath, like the coarse golden hair of some enormous head that had been combed with care. Its thickness wasn't just to keep out rain, it was to trap warmth. A thatched roof works like a natural feather duvet. Every bundle of straw contains countless tiny pockets of air, and it is these pockets that retain heat. When warmth from the hearth rises, the thatch holds much of it inside, allowing the house to heat quickly and cool slowly. Ironically, the material that modern people see as rustic, flammable and poor was once the most effective insulation technology for millions of Europeans across centuries. But the thatched roof wasn't only warm, it could breathe. In homes filled with smoke and moisture, this slow ventilation through thatch prevented dampness, kept the structure dry, and allowed the interior to remain surprisingly comfortable. Thanks to this balance between holding and releasing, the thatched roof became a perfect adaptation to the harsh medieval climate. However, not every region had enough straw for roofing. In mountain areas rich in stone rather than grain, people used another material: slate roofs. Slate roofs looked cold, heavy, and sharp because they were. They did not retain heat the way thatch did, but they came with advantages ideal for Highland weather: durability, resistance to strong winds, waterproofing, and the ability to withstand heavy snow that would collapse a thatched roof. Standing beneath a slate roof in a mountain home, the sound of wind scraping over the stone plates resembles metal clinking. Cold, rigid, yet strangely protective. Though not ideal for insulation, when paired with thick walls and a large hearth, it created a solid barrier in blizzards. And in the northernmost regions of Europe, where snowfalls weren't a few centimetres but half a metre deep, people turned the enemy into an ally: snow itself. The remarkable thing about snow is that when it accumulates deeply, it becomes an excellent insulator. It sounds paradoxical, but a thick layer of snow on the roof actually keeps the house warmer, like a cold blanket that prevents heat from escaping. When snow covered the roof, it compressed the air beneath, forming a dense insulating layer. Indoors became more stable, and warmth didn't vanish as quickly. For medieval people in the far north, snow wasn't just a threat, it was a teammate. They knew this, and often built their roofs at gentler angles to help snow settle. You sit by the fire while outside the wind howls through the blizzard, the roof trembling slightly beneath the weight of snow, and yet inside the room is strangely warm. Warm in a way only a true winter home can be. Overall, the medieval roof was not merely the top of a structure. It was the beating heart of warmth, the element that decided whether a family would survive winter's long nights. Medieval people had no thermometers, yet they understood better than anyone which materials suited their land. From thick bundles of straw and flat stone tiles to a natural blanket of snow, they turned whatever was available into weapons against the cold. If you stand before a medieval roof, observing the neat layers of straw, the precise arrangement of stone, or the settled snow above, you will see the patience of the people who built it. Their craftsmanship wasn't ornate or luxurious, but it carried a subtle wisdom honed over generations. Thatch, slate, or snow, each type carried its own story, shaped by the land and climate that created it. Yet all served one shared purpose: to hold warmth for the people, to guard them through the long winter nights, so that come morning they could continue their quiet and steadfast lives. And as the firelight flickers against the roof above you, glowing across each strand of straw or each slab of stone, perhaps you will feel what medieval people once felt. A roof doesn't merely shield from rain and sun. It wraps around the family like a great warm blanket, gentle yet enduring in a winter that never shows mercy. Among all the elements that allow a medieval house to survive through a merciless winter, nothing is more important than the hearth fire. If the roof is a blanket, the walls armour, and the raised floor a shield, then the hearth is the heart. A heart that beats continuously, keeping the family alive in the most literal sense. Without it, every layer of insulation, every clever material, every building technique becomes useless. And you can be absolutely certain of one thing. In the Middle Ages, people never allowed the fire to go out. Not merely a habit, but an unwritten law of survival. The fire had to be lit at dawn, kept burning all day, and buried under a layer of ash to survive the night. Medieval people had no lighters, no matches, and making fire by striking steel against flint was time-consuming, exhausting, and deeply unpleasant in the winter cold. One night of extinguished fire might mean a morning so freezing that relighting it became nearly impossible. So even when the whole household fell asleep, there was always a small glow somewhere in the hearth, a faint red breath like that of a creature standing guard over the family. But the hearth was not merely for warmth. It was the place where the most vital activities of a medieval household took place. Cooking, drying wet clothes, preparing herbal remedies, curing wood, repelling insects, preserving food, and even providing light to move about in the darkness. When you step into such a house, you immediately realise the hearth is the centre, not architecturally, but because the entire rhythm of life revolves around it. And here lies something fascinating. Early medieval hearths did not have chimneys, at least not for many centuries, which led to a very familiar result. Smoke. A lot of smoke. Thin, drifting smoke. Thick, clinging smoke. Smoke that settled into hair, clothing, and every surface of the house. The ceiling turned black as though painted, but it was not paint. It was decades of soot. It sounds unpleasant, but in truth that layer of soot had more benefits than you might imagine. Smoke disinfected, killing bacteria and mould in the wood. An invaluable effect in a climate that was cold and damp all year round. Smoke also repelled pests, for mice, insects, and many kinds of worms avoided heavily smoked spaces. And perhaps most surprising of all, smoke helped preserve the thatched roof. Thatch, being naturally vulnerable to rot, would decay in just a few years without smoke. But when smoke permeated the bundles of straw, the roof could last for a decade or more without mould consuming it. Not only the roof, the wooden structure of the house was constantly dried out by smoke. Damp wood rots, warps, and attracts pests, especially during winter when humidity climbs. Smoke hardened and preserved the timber, making it more durable and resistant. You could think of it as an ancient version of wood curing, a form of natural preservation discovered not by science, but by lived experience. Still, the hearth's most important role was warmth. The heat radiating from the fire seeped into the wooden walls, gradually pushing back the cold lurking beneath every door crack and floorboard. When you sat near the fire, you could feel distinct layers of temperature around you. Scorching heat close to the flames, pleasant warmth a little further away, and cold returning as soon as you stepped beyond that circle. This gradient meant the whole family instinctively gathered around the hearth. Not for the romantic reasons imagined in films, but because it was the only place in the house where they could truly feel alive. Interestingly, the hearth also revealed a family's social status. Poorer households had a simple fire pit, small flames fed by twigs and fallen branches. More prosperous families could afford better firewood, producing a larger, hotter fire, perhaps even with an additional hearth. Yet rich or poor, everyone shared one truth. Their lives depended on fire. For a medieval winter was not something to take lightly. Cold enough for water in a bucket to freeze inside the house. Cold enough for your breath to form mist even while standing by the fire. Cold enough that any carelessness, forgetting to add wood, allowing the fire to die at midnight, could leave the family shivering until dawn. And yet, in this harsh reality, the hearth became a symbol of resilience. The small, steady fire kept people warm for centuries before fireplaces, before central heating, long before the concept of an insulated home ever existed. The hearth fought not only the cold but loneliness. For every family story, every meal, every moment of togetherness happened beside its glow. Your family sits around the hearth, parents telling old stories, children curled up asleep nearby, thin smoke drifting upward, mingling with the soft yellow firelight. No machines, no electric bulbs, only the crackle of burning wood and the wind outside testing whether it can force its way in. But the wind gives up, because this place has a warm, steady heart beating at its centre, the hearth fire. And that is why medieval people always said, "A house without fire is not a house, If the hearth is the heart of a medieval house, then smoke is the temperamental personality that comes with that heart. Something useful yet troublesome. Something that saves lives yet nearly suffocates them. Modern people might be accustomed to the idea that smoke should go straight up a chimney and disappear, clean, neat, well-behaved. But in the medieval world, things were entirely different. Smoke was not simply something to get rid of. It was a member of the household, an uninvited guest who arrived without warning, yet could never be sent away. And because smoke was so important, yet so dangerous, medieval people were forced to invent countless creative ways to manage it. Sometimes these solutions were surprisingly effective. Sometimes they felt like humanity was trapped in an endless cycle of trial and error. But every choice told a story of adaptation in an age ruled by the cold. For poor families or those living in remote countryside, the most common solution was a smoke hole in the roof. Just a simple opening left for smoke to escape into the sky. It sounds crude, and it was crude, but it worked remarkably well. Smoke rose with the heat, found the opening and slipped outside like a wandering spirit in the winter night. However, this solution came with one obvious consequence. Not only did smoke escape, but cold wind entered. Sitting near the fire, warmth would only spread through a tiny patch of space, while above your head was a hole leading straight to the heavens. Winter wind had no hesitation in plunging downwards, hitting you directly and forcing the hearth to work twice as hard. But for the poor, it remained the best option. Easy to make, quick to repair, and most importantly, free. Meanwhile, wealthier households had a more elegant option: early stone chimneys. These were the ancestors of modern chimneys. Instead of a flimsy hole easily torn by the wind, they built a solid, upright structure of fitted stone, with an opening designed to draw smoke upwards, and sometimes even a cover to keep rain from entering. Of course, early medieval chimneys were far from perfect. Smoke still leaked into the house, still stained the walls and ceilings black, but they reduced the risk of suffocation, made interiors less foggy, and, crucially, allowed the hearth to be placed more flexibly, no longer forced to sit dead centre like before. The arrival of chimneys brought a significant improvement in comfort, but it also removed something the poor unintentionally possessed: a house filled with smoke. Because for medieval people, smoke was not just a byproduct of fire. It had many unexpected uses. First, smoke dried wood. Imagine living in a house where every structural element is timber, and outside lies a winter of constant damp. Wet wood is a disaster. It rots quickly, warps, attracts insects, and can cause the roof or walls to collapse. Smoke penetrated the pores of the timber, drawing out moisture, leaving behind a protective layer of soot that extended its lifespan dramatically. Smoke also repelled rats, killed lice, and drove off insects. Not because medieval people overanalyzed it, they simply noticed that smoky houses had fewer gnaw marks on their belongings. Habit became tradition, and tradition became inherited knowledge. Smoke also protected thatched roofs. Dry thatch exposed to moisture molds rapidly, but thatch smoked year-round becomes more durable and weather-resistant. Soot wasn't decorative, it was survival. Most striking of all is that when you enter a medieval home, the first thing you notice is not the furniture, but the light floating in the haze. A thick golden glow softened by a thin veil of smoke. It made the room gentler, dimmer, and strangely warmer. Not in temperature, but in feeling. A house with smoke was a house alive. A house with smoke was a house warm. A house with smoke was a house not abandoned. And because of that, medieval people learned to live peacefully with smoke. treating it like a slightly troublesome but dependable companion. Smoke irritated eyes, clung to clothing, made hair greasy, but it protected the roof from rot, kept mice from devouring grain, and prevented sickness in the damp season. By modern standards, a medieval home was almost always like a failed BBQ party, but for the people of that era, it was the atmosphere of life, and curiously, even wealthy homes with chimneys weren't fully free from smoke. Early stone systems had no seals, no dampers, no pressure controls. So there were evenings when, with a shift of the wind, smoke abandoned its path upward and instead drifted down into the room, as if the house itself wanted to whisper, "Do not think you control me." But whether it was a poor home with a smoke hole, or a wealthy home with a stone chimney, all shared the same survival philosophy. Fire warms, but smoke protects. The two must stay together. Without smoke, the thatch would rot, wood would mould, mice would multiply, and the house would lose warmth quickly. Without fire, the household would freeze, and so they learned to balance, driving out enough smoke to breathe, but keeping enough so the home retained its invisible shield. Today we expect clean chimneys and warm houses without a speck of soot. But looking back, you may find a quiet admiration for our ancestors. They not only used fire to fight winter, but turned smoke, something we consider an enemy, into a loyal companion. If the walls and roof were the outer layers of protection, then the floor was what you touched every single day, and also the place where you had to fight the cold of the medieval winter most directly. Just one moment of standing barefoot on a freezing wooden floor would be enough for you to understand why people of that time never intended to show off any kind of minimalist interior design the way we like to today. Keeping your feet warm wasn't a luxury. It was a matter of survival. And so, the floor became a silent battleground where medieval people constantly devised ways to resist the cold rising up from the earth. To cope with this, they covered the floor with thick straw, a simple material yet almost magically effective. When you step onto that layer of straw, it feels soft, dry, and most importantly, not cold. Straw forms a natural insulating layer, preventing the air between the floor and your feet from dropping in temperature too quickly. And of course it does. If there's anything that stays dry even when snow falls outside, it's straw. It's light, cheap, easy to replace, and when built up into several layers, it becomes a premium carpet that any medieval peasant could afford. But straw was only the first layer. On top of it, people spread rushes, marsh grasses cut and dried. Rushes were tougher than straw, more durable, and carried a light fragrance when freshly cut. You push your foot through that layer of dried grass and hear the familiar rustling sound. It is the sound of summer, the scent of wetlands, a tiny remnant of warmth lingering in the midst of winter. Medieval people replaced the rushes several times a year, mostly because they absorbed dust, crumbs, and things no one wanted to say aloud. But in winter, they were the lining of the floor, preventing cold from penetrating every step you took. In wealthier households, the floor was also covered with animal hides. When you step onto the bearskin or deerskin laid close to the hearth, you immediately feel what medieval people called winter luxury. Animal fur was naturally thick, an excellent insulator, soft, and warm to the touch. Putting your feet on it after a day walking in snow was like placing them on salvation itself, and you quickly understand why the wealthy proudly displayed large furs. They were not mere decorations, but proof that they could sleep without freezing like common folk. And woolen rugs. Those were rare and precious items, mostly found in well-off homes. Wool insulates well, does not absorb moisture quickly, and can be woven into beautiful patterns. When you sit on a woolen rug at night, the softness soothes your tired feet. In a smoky house, the firelight catches the fibres of the wool, making them glow faintly like strands of gold woven from summer sunlight. The very sunlight you long for with aching nostalgia. But even with a warm floor, the greatest challenge remained the bed. You could not sleep directly on the wooden floor no matter how thick the straw. Not because of a lack of comfort, but because you could literally freeze to death. Wood absorbs the cold from the ground and transfers it back into your body when you lie down. That's why medieval beds were always elevated and layered. The bottom layer of the bed was usually a straw mattress, a large sack stuffed with dry straw. When you lie on it, the straw forms tiny pockets of air that trap heat around your body. Every few weeks or months the straw needed replacing, as it would compress and lose its insulating ability. Medieval people didn't have spring mattresses, but the straw sack was the ancient and reliable equivalent. On top of the straw they spread wool. Wool not only insulates well, but also feels pleasant against the skin. When you pull a wool blanket over yourself, it feels light yet warm, like being wrapped in the last bit of warmth left at the end of the day. And finally, the most precious layer, animal fur. Wolf fur, bear fur, fox fur, sheep fleece, depending on the region and wealth of the household. When you burrow into that thick fur, warmth gathers quickly around your body, refusing to escape. On nights when the wind howls at the door as if trying to tear the roof off, this layer of fur is what keeps you from shivering endlessly through the dark hours. Medieval people slept within a combination of straw, wool, and fur, creating a bed both primitive and strangely effective. And the most important rule of all, they never lay directly on the floor. They knew the consequences: numb limbs, lost sensation, and worse, death from hypothermia. When you see such a multi-layered sleeping arrangement, you realize immediately that it was never about luxury. It was about survival. Entering a bedroom on a winter night, you see the firelight glint off a bed layered with care. The straw rustles softly as you sit on the edge. The wool meets your skin with gentle warmth, and the fur above traps your heat close. Outside, the wind whistles through the cracks. Snow taps lightly on the thatch. But you feel safe in this humble, carefully prepared nest. The floor and the bed, seemingly minor parts of the house, were in fact the last line of defence against the cold. If the roof and walls protected you from storms, then the floor and the bed protected you from the frozen earth itself, a cold not loud or dramatic, but persistent and far more dangerous. And when you lie down, pull the fur close, and listen to the crackling fire, you realize that a medieval bed, however simple, was crafted from everything people could gather to retain warmth. It stands as proof of human perseverance, creativity, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to a winter that never showed mercy. If in the modern world people try to soundproof, insulate, and eliminate odours, then during a medieval winter people did the exact opposite. They brought their livestock as close to themselves as possible. It doesn't sound romantic at all, but in the cold of northern Europe, the warmth radiating from animals was such a practical solution that you can't help admitting the ancients were either very clever or very desperate. Outside a traditional rural house in winter, the wind slices across your face like thin blades, and you can smell an indescribable mixture drifting up from the lower floor. When the door opens, a heavy, dense warmth escapes. Not entirely pleasant, but the very thing that kept people alive for centuries. And the simple truth is that warmth didn't come from the hearth. It came from the family's livestock. In many parts of northern Europe, especially during the Little Ice Age, two-story houses with the livestock kept on the lower floor became the standard design. Animals were kept below not for convenience, but because they generated a remarkable amount of heat. As you go down near the stalls, the warmth rises immediately, not the gentle heat of a hearth, but the dense warmth of muscle, breath, and the large bodies of animals packed together. That heat rises, spreads across the upper floor, and slowly warms the family's sleeping quarters. Sitting in the upstairs room, lined with straw and covered with wool and furs as usual, you only need to place your hand on the wooden floor to feel the warmth rising from below. Not hot, but enough to stop the cold from piercing straight into your bones. It is a crude, unclean warmth, but it is real. The kind of warmth no artificial heating system can truly replicate. This strange harmony between humans and livestock in winter wasn't simply a habit. It was a long-standing survival technique. Medieval people understood that cows and horses radiated heat constantly, and they didn't waste such a precious source of energy. In many cases, the more animals a house had, the warmer it was. A group of 6 cows could keep an entire upper floor at a tolerable temperature, even on nights when snow piled so high the door could not be opened. And this came with another advantage. Humans could hear unusual sounds from below. When the whole family slept, the shifting of cows, the strong breath of horses, and the stamping of goats all acted as a natural alarm system. In a world without secure locks and without night guards, knowing if someone crept into your animal stalls was no small advantage. Of course, this shared heat model was not perfect. You still had to endure the smell. You still heard noises all night. And sometimes you'd realise that the rising warmth came along with things no one wants to think about too closely. But in winter, people had to prioritise, and the priority of the medieval world was simply not to freeze to death. In truth, even small houses without upper and lower floors tried to make use of animal heat. Many families let dogs and goats sleep near the hearth or close to the bed. To modern people, that sounds unhygienic, but for medieval people, sleeping next to a large dog was entirely sensible. Dogs were warm, alert, and, undeniably, warmer than humans in winter. In mountain regions where night temperatures dropped below +, animals and humans practically shared the same roof. Not because they lacked space, but because if separated, both could die. A house with many animals was noticeably warmer than one without. In such circumstances, the line between barn and home blurred. Every living creature relied on one another to survive. You lie down in bed, pulling the wool and fur tightly around you. Through the floorboards below, the deep rumbling sounds of cattle drift upward, blending with the howling wind outside. The hearth burns low, its light moving gently on the walls, and when the warmth from the lower floor seeps into your back, you understand a very simple truth. Any living body gives off heat, and winter leaves no room for pride. Medieval people didn't romanticize this. They didn't write poetry about the beauty of sleeping above livestock, but they were grateful for the warmth. It kept them from being swallowed by the cold. It allowed children to survive their first winters. It kept the elderly from shivering until dawn. And it helped humans endure the coldest periods in European history. You might not want to live in such a house. You might find the smell unpleasant, the noise bothersome, and the chaos ill-suited to modern life. But if you immerse yourself in that atmosphere, the thin smoke under the ceiling, the crackle of firewood, the animals below, the warmth rising through the floor, you will feel something very real. This is how millions lived, loved, and survived through winters that never showed mercy. And sometimes The simplest solutions are the ones that save the most generations. Medieval people understood a truth we sometimes forget. Warmth is born in small spaces, and if you let heat escape, you will pay for it with your own body's temperature. Therefore, the modest houses of that time were all designed according to a principle never written into law, yet everyone knew by heart. If you want to survive the winter, you must shrink your world. You open the door of a medieval house and step inside, and the first thing you notice is there are barely any windows, not because they disliked sunlight, but because in their eyes, a large window was nothing more than a gaping hole for freezing air to force its way in, sweeping away every attempt to keep the house warm. Medieval windows were often so small that you had to lean close to see outside, and sometimes they were covered with animal fat, hides, or thin wooden boards. Dark and confined, yes, but in exchange, you weren't shivering while trying to stop your breath turning into frost. Small windows were only the beginning. Inside the house, medieval people created additional layers of protection, as if wrapping the home in a giant fur coat. Thick cloth curtains, if the family could afford them, or animal hides hung along the walls formed the classic insulation method. You touch one of these hides, feeling the rough texture, the smoky scent, the warmth lingering in it. These wall coverings did more than keep heat in. They created a sense of enclosure, like an embrace around the room. To minimize the flow of cold air, they even hung curtains around the bed, turning it into a tiny inner chamber within the larger room. This is the medieval concept of a room within a room, not for luxury, but to protect warmth, as if guarding the last source of life. You pull aside a curtain and step into the small space the family used for sleeping. Firelight glows across the fabric layers, casting the tiny enclosure in warm orange hues, giving a sense of safety that a large room could never offer in winter. You sit down on the bed. The heat doesn't scatter into empty space like in a big room. It stays, wraps around you, clings to you like an invisible fur cloak. But that still wasn't all. Medieval people arranged their interior layout in ways that helped heat circulate sensibly, like instinctive thermal engineers. Bedrooms were placed deep inside the house, as far as possible from the main door. The less draft, the better. Bedrooms were deliberately small. A large medieval bedroom was no different from declaring that its owner wished to freeze to death. A small space allowed warmth to gather, and even a tiny hearth could keep the room warm through the night. When you enter a medieval bedroom, you immediately understand that it wasn't designed to show wealth, nor was it meant for modern comfort. It was designed around one core principle: never give the cold a chance to win. And to prevent precious heat from escaping, medieval people made everything small. Small windows, small rooms, small beds, even small corridors. Walls plastered with straw, earth, or animal hair, each layer adding a touch more warmth. You quietly pull the thick wooden door shut behind you. There is no modern locking sound, but you immediately feel the enclosure of the space. Outside, the wind screams, but inside there is only the crackle of the fire and the gentle stillness of warm air. In that moment, it feels as though the whole house is curling inward, wrapping around you, refusing to let the cold bite into your bones. Interestingly, the more rooms a medieval house had, the warmer it became. In a modern house, too many rooms mean more cleaning and maintenance, but for medieval people, this was a survival strategy. Every closed door was an extra defense against drafts. Every added wall was a barrier against the winter outside. And every small room was a nest where people tried to protect the most precious thing they had, their warm breath. This wasn't only true for rural houses, but also for monasteries, inns, and even the castles of the noble class. The more divided the living space, the easier it was to retain heat. Those long, drafty stone corridors you imagine from movies only existed in grand architecture. And that is precisely why many nobles slept in curtained rooms, using large bed hangings like fortresses of warmth. You walk into a hallway and immediately feel the chill seeping through the cracks. You return to the bedroom, close the door, and that familiar warmth envelops you again. Without explanation, you understand that medieval people lived by instinct, by inherited experience, and by the refined intuition of those who had no choice but to think, constantly, about how to keep their homes from becoming blocks of ice. In their world, warmth didn't come from magic, but from layers added year after year. Every wall, every hide, every door, every bed curtain, each was proof of human persistence against an enemy that never rested, winter. And as you lie in that tiny room, listening to the wind rage outside while feeling the warmth around you, you realize that sometimes the greatest victories do not come from swords, but from a small door, a thick curtain, and the quiet wisdom of our ancestors. On winter nights in the Middle Ages, the first thing you have to understand is this. No one was allowed to sleep alone. Not because people were afraid of ghosts, nor because they enjoyed the sense of cosy family togetherness, but because sleeping alone during the Little Ice Age was practically an act of suicide. No matter how many layers of walls, thatched roofs, or animal furs a house had, it could not completely hold back the cold lurking outside. And in a world without heaters, without electric blankets, without dual-function climate control, human warmth, more precisely a pile of people lying next to each other, was the strongest radiator humanity could think of at the time. That's why medieval bedrooms often resembled a communal heating station, more than a place for private rest. The entire family, parents, children, and even distant relatives stopping by, would all squeeze into the same large bed, a thick straw mattress, or a sleeping nest piled high with animal skins. Imagine it! Waking up in the middle of the night, turning over only to bump into someone else's elbow, or accidentally touching an icy foot. Not romantic like in the movies, it was practical, cramped, and utterly survival-driven. But despite the crowding, shared beds had one golden advantage: warmth. The heat from 4, 5, or even 6 bodies radiated out, pushing back the cold outside like a living fortress. And for medieval people, this was a technology that needed no maintenance, no fuel, no charging, just everyone lying as close together as possible. You settle into that shared bed, your breath mingling with the smell of smoke and the faint scent of damp wool. But the warmth spreading along your back tells you you've just escaped freezing to death for one more night. Near the hearth, where the fire was kept burning through the night, you would often find servants or those who did the day's hardest labour curled up asleep. This was a privilege of the labourers. Though their work was exhausting, they slept in the warmest corner of the house. When you walk past the hearth, the firelight flickers over thick blankets covering tightly packed bodies, sometimes so close to the flames it's as if they were warming themselves by sheer willpower rather than wood. Smoke clung to their hair, their clothes, and the entire room, but in exchange they slept far more comfortably than those in the adjacent chambers. And the children. They had a unique kind of medieval bed that modern people might find adorable. Alcove beds, small sleeping compartments enclosed in wood or heavy curtains. The children were tucked into these like kittens inside a warm box, windproof and small enough that heat didn't dissipate. You peek inside and see the little ones curled up in wool and straw, their breath forming tiny clouds, yet their faces utterly peaceful. These alcove beds didn't just keep them warm, They created a sense of safety, a tiny world where children were shielded from the harsh cold outside. In larger households, the beds themselves often had curtains, creating a private warm chamber within a bigger room. When you approach and gently pull aside the heavy drapes, the warmth trapped inside immediately rushes out, making it obvious why medieval people considered curtained beds a precious asset. The curtains didn't just block drafts, they trapped every bit of heat generated by human bodies. Sometimes just two people sleeping together behind those curtains could stay warm all night without adding more wood to the fire. Of course, shared sleeping also led to some interesting situations. Medieval people weren't familiar with the idea of personal space, so someone snoring like thunder, turning constantly, or accidentally hugging the wrong person wasn't a big deal. On the contrary, for them, it was normal, part of life. Something that reminded you there was warmth around you, that there were still people breathing beside you through a long winter night, when it was so cold outside that water froze inside wooden buckets. Those noises could even feel comforting, proof that life still persisted. Another reason communal beds became a survival tradition was the sheer difference in temperature between indoors and outdoors. Stand near the door for only a few seconds, and you could feel icy drafts slicing through layers of wool, and you immediately understood why everyone fought for a bit of body heat from others. Sometimes just one cracked door or a forgotten window was enough to make the entire household shiver uncontrollably. So gathering everyone into one warm spot was the most natural, effective, and economical solution. Even in wealthier homes, with large hearths, private fireplaces, and plenty of animal hides, people still chose to sleep together on the coldest nights. No one was foolish enough to try sleeping alone for comfort at a time when hypothermia could mean you never woke up again. Thus, whether you were a noble or a peasant, human body heat, sometimes too strong, too damp, too close, was still the most important thing that let you see the next sunrise. Human warmth, in that sense, became the truest form of medieval radiator. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't as gentle as an electric blanket today. But it was the only thing that could defeat the winter, an ancient technology never obsolete as long as the cold exists. And if you lie down on that big shared bed, listening to the wind howling outside the walls and feeling warmth radiating from the bodies beside you, you will immediately understand something medieval people knew all too well. Sometimes, survival is simply a matter of keeping each other warm through the night. If in the modern world you only need to turn on the heater, shut the windows, make a cup of hot cocoa and curl up under an electric blanket, then in a medieval winter, survival required far, far more than that. Each day was not merely daily life, but a series of rituals, sequential, meticulous, and almost compulsory. Because if even one detail was forgotten, one habit neglected, the entire house could be torn apart by the cold, and the family inside might wake up to a morning where no one wakes up at all. One of the most important rituals was closing the door before sunset. It sounds simple, but for medieval people the door was not merely an entrance. It was the only barrier between the warmth inside and the lethal cold outside. When the sun began to sink, the wind shifted, and the temperature plummeted, leaving the door ajar for just a few minutes was enough to make the house as cold as an ice cellar. Imagine it. A single gust of wind slipping in would sweep away all the warmth accumulated throughout the day, from the fire, from the furs, from human bodies. And so, when the final light touched the threshold, someone in the house would get up, pull the heavy door closed, fasten the latch or wedge a beam in place, as if locking winter out. Beyond the door was the fire, something guarded more strictly than treasure. Medieval people almost never let the fire go out. A fire was not just for cooking. It was the heart of the home, where warmth was born, where dampness fled, where wood dried, where everyone gathered when darkness fell. You sit by the hearth, stretch your hands toward the glow, and understand immediately that if the fire died, you would have to start it again from scratch. And in winter, that was a dangerous, difficult, and sometimes impossible task. The small embers buried under ash and kept alive through the night were a constant reminder. A single lapse, a single moment of sleep, and the fire would die, and the whole house might follow. Another habit was bringing the reserve wood inside. Living through a long winter made firewood more precious than gold. The family had to spend summer and autumn cutting, drying, and gathering every bundle. When snow buried everything outside, fetching wood became a battle for survival. So at night, before sleeping, they brought in enough wood to keep the fire alive until morning. You look at the pile stacked beside the hearth and understand that each log represents 1 hour of warmth. Use too much and you are wasteful. Use too little and you're at risk. In regions with heavy snowfall there was another ritual, adding more straw to the roof. It sounds strange, but thick straw was the warmest coat a thatched roof could wear. When snow weighed heavily on it, the straw trapped heat, blocked wind, and turned the house into a giant nest. You look up at the ceiling, see the thick thatch outlined by firelight, and feel as if the whole house were wrapped in a massive golden blanket. And if you think medieval people had no hot water bottle to warm their beds, then you've underestimated their creativity. Without plastic or rubber, they used animal skin pouches to hold hot water and place them beneath the bedding. Before bedtime, someone would boil a pot of water, pour it into the leather pouch, tie it shut, and tuck it under the covers. When you slide your feet into that spot, warmth spreads through the blankets, turning the icy bed into something bearable. It was one of the rare moments of genuine comfort, a small luxury in an age with very little comfort. All these rituals, shutting the door on time, keeping the fire alive, bringing in firewood, thickening the roof, warming the bed, may seem like small, repetitive tasks. But they formed the rhythm of winter life, a rhythm in which carefulness determined a family's survival. Inside the winter house, you feel each layer of warmth humans created. The tightly closed door, the hanging curtains, the glowing fire, the thick straw underfoot, the bed warmed by a heated leather pouch, and you realize just how fragile life is. Medieval people did not build houses for beauty, did not keep fire for pleasure, did not spread straw for decoration. Everything they did served one purpose: to keep winter from winning. The striking thing is that these rituals were never written in books, never preached by elders. They formed through experience, transmitted through reminders, habits, and nights when someone forgot to bring in wood and the whole family nearly froze. Every small action was a reminder of lessons learned at a very high cost. And right now, as the bed warms beneath the carefully heated leather pouch, as you hear the wind scream through the thatch but fail to break through, you understand that in the dense darkness of a medieval winter, there was something stronger than the cold: human perseverance, nurtured daily by rituals that were ordinary yet sacred, simple yet capable of saving an entire generation. Because in that winter, even the smallest mistake sometimes meant no one had the chance to correct it the next morning. When we look back at how medieval people built each wall, tended each fire, spread each layer of straw, or huddled close together to sleep, we recognize the clearest truth. In a world where winter showed no mercy, survival depended on patience, subtlety, and a spirit of interdependence. With no modern technology, no machinery. They fought the cold with the simplest tools, and that simplicity became the root of their resilience. Those humble houses, those cramped sleeping alcoves, those tiny repeated routines were not only survival strategies, but reflections of how people understood life itself. Warmth does not appear on its own. It is created, nurtured, tended. Every door pulled shut, every log carried indoors, every heated skin pouch placed in a bed spoke of one familiar but easily forgotten philosophy. Safety and peace always require meticulous preparation, and perhaps, among the layers of straw, wool, fur and smoke, the greatest lesson medieval winter left behind is this: humans are strongest when they keep each other warm. No one slept alone. No one faced the cold alone. Warmth spreading from one body to another was a quiet reminder that life came not only from the fire, but from one another's presence. Looking back, we understand that what carried them through those winters was not only architectural technique, but perseverance, attention to small details, and the belief that as long as there was warmth inside the house, tomorrow still held hope. And how grateful we are that even now we can connect with one another through small stories like this. Thank you for staying, for listening all the way to the end. Your presence, wherever you are in the world, is the gentle warmth that keeps the flame of this channel alive, and I truly cherish that. Sleep well, my dear friends.